So you asked me to talk about sexuality and dementia in long-term care, and that's a pretty pervasive problem, and it's a challenge for all nursing homes. There are approximately 15,500 nursing homes in the country that accommodate and house 1.3 million seniors. Virtually every skilled nursing facility deals with the issue of sexuality and dementia. The challenge for nursing homes and nursing home administrators and the director of nursing would be when a resident has cognitive impairment, whether it's Alzheimer's disease, senile dementia, vascular dementia, or some other cognitive impairment, and that resident wants to be sexually active. The challenge and the obligation for a nursing home is to respect a resident's rights and accommodate them to the extent possible while keeping them safe. Just because somebody is in a nursing home, they don't give up their rights, and that includes the right for sexual intimacy, which is a basic human need. But what happens when someone is cognitively impaired and the resident has dementia, and it's not certain whether or not they have the capacity to consent to sexual activity? And that's the real challenge, and I see that with nursing homes across the country and have seen that with nursing homes throughout the country, both when I represented the government, the federal agency that oversees the regulations that deal with nursing homes, and for the past 7 years representing nursing homes. So here's a case in point that illustrates how challenging it is. And I often talk about the Rayhons case. Henry Rayhons was a 7-term state representative in Iowa. And in his 70s, it was a second marriage for him and a second marriage for his wife. At some point after Mr. and Mrs. Rayhons married, again, both in their 70s, Mrs. Rayhons was admitted to a skilled nursing facility. Unfortunately, she had dementia. And at one point, when Mr. Rayhons went to visit his wife in the nursing home, the administrator, the social worker, and the physician called him into an office, and they said, here's a care plan. You can no longer be sexually intimate with your wife because she can't indicate consent. She could not articulate whether she consented. Mr. Rayhons took a copy of the care plan and left, came back a few days later, and his wife was in a semi-private room. After he left, the resident in the other bed on the other side of the privacy curtain called the nurse and said, I think I heard noises that sounded like sex. Well, they told the administrator, and the administrator checked a camcorder that was in the hallway, and they saw, according to the court reports, Mr. Rayhons deposit his wife's undergarments as he left the room. They promptly called the police. The police took Ms. Rayhons' sheets and they tested it for semen, which tested positive, and it was a match for Mr. Rayhons, and he was interrogated. He was charged with raping his wife. At the time, as I said, Mr. Rayhons was in his 70s, and he would have spent the rest of his life in jail if he was convicted. The jury found that he was not guilty, but it was very difficult for him. Imagine going through a prosecution where you're charged with raping your wife. And what's interesting, and this highlights how challenging this is for nursing homes, the prosecution had an expert forensic psychiatrist who testified that Mrs. Rayhons could not consent. Likewise, there were medical experts for the defendant, Mr. Rayhons, who testified that indeed there was consent, even though it was not articulated. There were no signs of trauma. There were no behavioral changes after a visit. And in fact, according to the testimony, Mrs. Rayhons would smile when her husband visited. In addition, there was testimony that they went to church every Sunday and he would kiss her on the cheek. After the Lord's Prayer, he had a combine. He was also a farmer, and she would ride with him on his combine. So by all accounts, this was a very loving husband who ultimately was charged with a felony for sexually assaulting his wife. And I mentioned the fact that there was a psychiatrist, a forensic psychiatrist, and forensic experts on both sides that differed to show how difficult this is for nursing homes. I'm often asked when I do presentations to clients or others on sexuality and dementia, what can we do? Well, it's absolutely essential that there be a competent assessment of somebody's decision-making capacity. I'm also asked, well, can our social worker do that? Social worker can do that assessment, but it shouldn't stop there, and I've taken the position it's insufficient. I always recommend having a psychiatrist or a gerontological psychologist with expertise in the area of sexuality and dementia. Part of the problem in doing an assessment to determine whether or not someone has the capacity to consent to sexual intimacy is that their level of decision-making capacity can wax and wane within a day. There's a condition referred to as sundowner's syndrome, where somebody is lucid during the day, but as the day wears on and in the evening, they become less lucid and their decision-making process is clouded. Likewise, decision-making capacity can wax and wane from day to day, depending upon the underlying pathology, depending upon a number of factors. If somebody spikes a temperature, if there's new medication that's started, or a host of other conditions. So I recommend that the decision-making capacity be done by a psychiatrist or a geriatric psychologist with expertise in this area, that there be documented input from the interdisciplinary team, which would be the nurses, the social worker, the nurse aides, the activities director, everyone at the facility who's interfacing with the resident, and that the assessment, the clinical assessment, is ongoing. It's a dynamic rather than a static process. It's not one shot. We've done an assessment and this resident has decision-making capacity. We can forget about it. It has to be ongoing, or at least I recommend that. It's a very fluid, as the underlying condition is fluid. I've had a number of cases where, and there have been a number of cases throughout the country in nursing homes where, like the Rayhons situation, where there's been an allegation of inappropriate sexual contact, and the question is whether or not it's inappropriate, and that depends on the decision-making capacity. If someone has the capacity to consent, then they have the right to be sexually intimate. So, and again, as I said, that's a pretty pervasive problem. I can't imagine any nursing home that doesn't deal with that issue.